I'm Adam.
Kia ora, I'm Eugene, and this is Long Story Short, a podcast about crimes, catastrophes, scandals and scammers, secrets and lies. Strange tales you've never heard of and surprising twists on stories you thought you knew.
And this is part 2 of a 2-part mini-series. Can we call it a mini-series?
Yeah.
Mini-3? Yeah, okay, it's a mini-series.
Yeah.
Focusing on one of Aotearoa, New Zealand's most controversial murder cases, the Sounds murder case. Olivia Hope and Ben Smart were two young people who vanished from the Marlborough Sounds after a party attended by 1,500 people. And the man the police were very suspicious of from very early on was a local called Scott Watson. And if you haven't listened to part 1, you really need to, because this part 2 is going to be a bit hard on its own.
It'll get a bit confusing. And look, if you have listened to episode 1, which I hope you have, you'll know that we finished the last episode talking about Montage B, this photo identity board which included the so-called blink photo of Scott Watson, the one that finally led water taxi driver Guy Wallace to connect Scott Watson to the mystery man. We made a bit of a big deal about it. Now, in case anyone was thinking that we were a bit too focused on that, not to jump ahead of ourselves, I just want to read you something from a court decision which was made in late 2025. This decision, which we'll come to in more detail, goes into great detail about Montage B, and in fact, it describes it as the quote-unquote key issue at stake. So, we're going to spend a bit more time talking about Montage B, but we're also going to go through other evidence in this intriguing case, one that has remained prominent for more than 2 decades.
Okay, quick recap. Olivia Hope, 17. Ben Smart, 21. They'd travelled to the Marlborough Sounds separately, though they were friends who'd met first a year earlier for the New Year's Eve party at Furno Lodge. That's their plan. So they end up together during the evening and in the early hours of the morning decide to call it a night. So their original plan is to go to where Ben is staying. That's a batch, holiday house, crib, call it what you like, on the other side of the bay. But on the way there, they want to stop off at the chartered yacht where Olivia is staying, the Tamarack, with the idea that they'd grab some clothes and then make their way to the batch. But best laid plans and all that, the person who was meant to pick them back up once they got their clothes kind of forgot and just went straight to the batch. So they then thought, okay, well, we can kip down on the Tamarack, seeing it is Olivia's home for the duration. But the Tamarack already had too many people on it, so they needed to find somewhere else for the night. And so they figure they'll head back to shore. When a water taxi driven by a man called Guy Wallace drops off Olivia's sister at the Tamarack, Ben and Olivia take the chance and they hop into the water taxi. Also in the water taxi was a young couple, Hayden and Sarah, who will become important in the story, and someone who would become known as the mystery man. The mystery man we've spent the whole of part 1 talking about. A bloke travelling on his own. As they left the Tamarack, the mystery man offered a place in his cabin for the night to Ben and Olivia, and they accepted, despite him seeming somewhat creepy towards Olivia. And that's the last time they're seen. So after their disappearance was reported and the police started an investigation within a week, they're focusing on Scott Watson, who'd stood out at the party for his somewhat crude and drunken and annoying behaviour. So the police and also a reporter show photos and a bit of video of Scott Watson to Guy Wallace. But time and again, Wallace said, no, don't recognise him. And then it all turns, he's shown Montage B. And bang, suddenly the police had this connection between the mystery man and Scott Watson. But that alone wasn't enough to arrest him, but it did open other avenues, other possibilities for the police. And that's because Guy Wallace had already said of the mystery man, whoever it might be, that he had served him at the bar during the party. So that put the mystery man inside Furno Lodge and meant the police could see if they could find anyone else who could back up Guy Wallace's recollection. So it sort of opens a door to a whole pile more potential witnesses. So you got that? Being in the bar just opens everything right up.
Yeah. So the bar manager that night, a woman called Roz, remembered a bloke who sat in a corner of the bar for an hour to an hour and a half, who she served 5 or 6 bourbons to. And her description of him was similar to the description initially given by Guy Wallace. Then on March 20, 1998, she was shown this famous montage B, and the photo she picked out was photograph number 3 from that lineup of photos, the so-called blink photo of Scott Watson. Again, though, she said it was mostly the eyes that sort of stuck out, not so much his hair. The hair is shorter in this photograph than the man I remember, but I would say that with longer hair, yes, it's the same man. So the police were away, right, on the basis of Guy Wallace's identification, backed up by Roz, except there was something else that Guy Wallace was adamant about, something that did not help the police case. And this would become the most contentious aspect of the case against Scott Watson.
From day one, Guy Wallace was certain that the boat at which he dropped Ben and Olivia and the mystery man was a ketch. And we all know what a ketch is, right?
Well, Captain Dudding, why don't you remind us?
A ketch has, I learn as I read the script, has 2 masts.
Oh, come on, you knew that.
Kind of. Yeah, from when I read the script last time. More than that, though, Guy Wallace had a really vivid recollection of other details of the boat. He described it as an old timber ketch with round portholes. He said it was white with a dark blue stripe, and there were lots of ropes, and he helped police draw a sketch of it. In the first few days of the search for the couple, like really, really early on, this sketch and description was spread far and wide, and police and boaties searched for the ketch. And there were other people who reported seeing a ketch, similar to the one described by Guy Wallace, including a couple who even said they saw it several times, including on New Year's Day and January the 2nd. So these are like the vital days after the disappearance. At the time of that last sighting, which, by the way, was near a place called Cannibal Cove, they said they saw 2 nervous-looking young people huddled together on board, a man and a woman with long blonde hair. And yes, Olivia had long blonde hair, but also a third person, an older man, standing on the deck. We should say this sighting was the subject of much questioning during the trial. There was another piece of evidence that tended to support Guy Wallace's recollection of the boat and the number of masts, Hayden and Sarah. So that's the other couple who were on the water taxi when Ben and Olivia were dropped off with the mystery man. They had some things to say about the boat as well. So Sarah remembered that the deck of the boat was reasonably high up. Hayden was even more descriptive. He said he'd had to lift himself off his seat on the water taxi to grab the yacht's railing to steady the boat, while Ben, Olivia and mystery man got on board. What's more, he said it was a ketch, 2 masts, and quite a large ketch. In his first statement, he said it had heaps of ropes. So this is matching what Guy had said. I can remember a mast near to the back, and there was heaps of ropes coming off that. Now, it should be said that under questioning in the trial, Hayden admitted he hadn't actually seen the second mast itself. He inferred there was one because of the way the ropes dangled from the mast that he could see. And he did not use the word ketch or reference a second mast in the first 3 statements he gave to the police in January 1998. But just because he didn't use those actual words doesn't necessarily mean anything, of course, but it's worth noting.
For the first few days of the inquiry, there were air and sea searches for the ketch, but by the weekend of January 10-11, Detective Inspector Rob Pope, who's the cop in charge, he was, quote, fairly certain that this ketch does not exist, notwithstanding the numerous sightings of a ketch similar to the one described by Guy Wallace. That's the conclusion that Rob Pope has come to.
That's weird, right?
Yeah, it's certainly a point of contention, let's say that. But we should also say that no ketch matching the description was ever seized by the police. So there were these sightings, but never did they actually seize a yacht and go, this is the ketch. So when it came time for the trial, this whole issue of whether there even was a ketch or not took up an extraordinary amount of time. The prosecution set out to prove that it could identify every single floating thing in Endeavour Inlet that night. I remember during the trial, for a number of weeks, it seemed more like a marine inquiry into the movement of boats in the Marlborough Sounds than a murder case, when there was boatie after boatie called to give evidence about them arriving, and leaving Endeavour Inlet, even when that's all they had to say. Even if they had no dealings whatsoever with Ben, Olivia, or Scott Watson, or anyone else relevant. The point was, the prosecution wanted to prove that it had identified every single yacht, boat in the vicinity at New Year's, and it could eliminate all of them as the one Olivia and Ben had been dropped off at, except one. And that one belonged to Scott Watson, according to the police. Unfortunately for the prosecution, his boat, the Blade, was not a ketch, 2 masts, as Captain Dudding reminded us. It was a sloop, 1 mast. And it was not large. It was a home-built 8.6 metre vessel. It did not have portholes like the ones Guy Wallace described, nor the elaborate rope work that both Guy and Hayden described. And it was steel, not timber, like this mystery ketch. Let's take a quick break.
Okay. On Monday, January the 12th, 10 days after Ben and Olivia were reported missing, the Watson family home in Picton was searched and Scott Watson's boat, the Blade, was seized. It was lifted out of the water and taken away to be forensically examined, searched. It was a dramatic moment, one that was really covered widely by the media at the time.
Yeah, I vividly remember the TV news coverage that night. It was a huge deal. Anyway.
And from that moment on, Scott Watson isn't just the police's prime suspect, he's now publicly known as the police's prime suspect. So everything began to build around him. And so his behaviour at the party was examined in great detail. Comments he'd made in the years leading up to that night were dragged back up and used as evidence to insinuate that he had a long-held desire to murder. Not that he wanted to kill Ben and Olivia in particular, just he wanted to kill someone, anyone, really. 3 witnesses were called to tell the jury about different incidents, including one in 1997 when Watson and a friend went to a pub, got annoyed with a woman there. Then later on, back at home at the friend's house, Watson said, yeah, he should have killed her and got rid of them, her and her mates. There's no evidence, though, that this was anything more than idle, if sinister talk.
But the most powerful cache of evidence came from that forensic examination of the yacht.
By the way, can we talk about the name of this yacht for a minute? The Blade, a pretty unfortunate name for your boat if you've been charged with a double murder, presumably carried out aboard your boat?
Yeah, he did call it that some years ago, and it's interesting, but clearly not evidence of anything. But yeah, I take your point.
Okay, sure.
Look, what the police were on the hunt for were any physical clues that Scott Watson was the killer and his boat was the crime scene. So the first thing they noticed was that the boat's appearance had changed after January 1, i.e. sometime after it left Endeavour Inlet in the early hours of the morning, when police allege he had the couple on board, murdered them and got rid of the bodies somewhere. No one's ever found the bodies, by the way. The Blade had a new coat of paint, changing it from what was described as a terracotta red-brown colour to blue, and a self-steering gear wind vane. Look, I'm no nautical expert, I'm no Captain Dudding, so you're on your own there as to exactly what that was. But anyway, it was usually at the stern, and it had been taken down and stowed away.
So what's being suggested here is that he was covering his tracks somehow, so his boat didn't look like it did on New Year's, so throwing the cops off the scent, something like that.
Yeah, and the other thing that was noted was that the boat had been extensively cleaned inside the cabin. So all the surfaces had been wiped, removing any trace of anything, including fingerprints. Radio cassette tape covers. Yes, this was the time when people listened to cassette tapes. They'd also been wiped. 2 squabs on board, those sort of foam mattressy cushion things. They'd recently had pieces cut or ripped out of them, and there was another squab that was missing altogether.
So what's being suggested there is he did some kind of clean-up job to remove evidence.
There were 2 other things. The inside of the hatch cover had 176 scratch marks, which the Crown called evidence to say was caused by fingernails. I remember that hatch cover being physically pulled out in the court, and the impact was chilling because it sort of conjured up the thoughts of these 2 desperate young people trapped inside and trying to get out. It was, powerful evidence.
All of those things are circumstantial, though. None of them are direct evidence of Ben or Olivia having been on the boat. But there was one piece of evidence used by the Crown that they said was direct evidence, and it came from a tiger blanket.
Yeah, so when the boat was searched, there was this tiger blanket found on board. You know what those are, right? They're a blanket with a large tiger on it.
World famous, the old
World
tiger
famous.
blanket.
Yeah.
Love it.
Who doesn't have one? It was taken away for forensic examination in Auckland, and about 400 hairs were collected, entwined within the fabric. Some of them were really small.
Is 400 hairs in a blanket a lot?
I have no idea. I've never counted. I don't know. What's normal? Anyway, the number of hairs wasn't really the point. There were a couple of examinations of the hairs done around this time. This is in January 1998. Nothing much of interest was found. Several months later, in March, the hairs were examined again, and this time the forensic scientist spotted 2 long blonde hairs that she had not seen previously. Forensic testing was carried out on those 2 hairs, and the conclusion was that the testing, and I'll use the Crown's words here, strongly supported the proposition that the 2 head hairs were those of Olivia Hope.
So this feels seriously slam dunk. This is really damning. That puts her on the boat. But let's just go back over all that evidence gathered from the boat from the perspective of Scott Watson's supporters and the evidence the defence produced at the trial.
So let's start with the repainting of the boat. Basically, it's like, yeah, so what? He had long planned to paint his boat. And by the way, the mystery ketch, remember, was said to be blue, whereas the blade was terracotta red-brown and the fresh paint job was blue. It'd be kind of dumb to deliberately repaint your boat to the colour of the boat that everyone's looking for.
This is a good point. So the cleaning of all the surfaces and stuff, the defence's case is, again, kind of, so what? He's a bit of a clean freak. He loved his boat. There was also evidence presented about how seasoned boaties are particularly fastidious in cleaning because of the corrosive effects of salt water.
You would know that well, Captain Dudding.
Yes.
The squabs with the bits cut out and another bit missing, well, you could see there were burn marks around the edges of one of the holes. There had been a paint spill on one of them. And as for the missing one, it was just missing. What are you getting at was basically their point.
And the creepy scratch marks on the hatch, the defence said it was actually done by Scott Watson's nieces and nephews. They also said the scratch marks couldn't have been made while the hatch was closed.
Yeah, so maybe I just need to explain that.
Yeah,
It's a little bit hard on a podcast, but like the way that the hatch came. So you know what a hatch is?
I do know what a hatch is.
Thank you, Captain
I've
Dudding.
been on boats just a little.
So it's basically
A lid.
little lid that lets you get down into the inside of the boat on the deck. And the defence pointed out that the way that the hatch came down, if it had been closed, the extent of some of the scratches couldn't have gone as far as they had. Does that make sense?
Because they would be against the lid that they were closing.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, and by the way, that suggestion that the nieces and nephews had made, it wasn't anything sinister. It was just,
Sounds sinister,
kids being
to be
kids.
fair.
Yeah, kids being kids on board that scratched it and
Yeah.
made a mess of his hatch.
Yeah.
Let's get back to the evidence. The hair evidence, well, that was a huge focus for the defence during the trial because there was so much to cross-examine witnesses about. First, remember the 400 hairs found on the blanket, which were mostly short, dark hairs. They were screened twice in January 1998, looking for anything of interest. Neither time were the long blonde hairs spotted.
And side note, if you're wondering, in the lead up to the trial, the hairs from the tiger blanket were never actually compared to Ben Smart's hair because his hair colour and Scott Watson's hair colour were similar. So telling the difference would have been really time consuming and expensive. But you got to think, actually, in the current DNA era, that could have been a different situation, right?
Could have been.
You just have to throw your hairs into the magic DNA counter, and
it just happens magically. These days. Anyway, the blonde hairs, they weren't found until there was a third examination of the hairs from the tiger blanket. So 2 searches of these 400 hairs in January, no long blonde hair spotted. Another search in March, bingo, there they are. One 15 centimetres long, the other 25 centimetres long. You might think,
Think about this too. By the time of the third search in March, police had also recovered what they called reference hairs from a hairbrush belonging to Olivia Hope. And on the day of that third search, the trial heard the reference hairs and the tiger blanket hairs were examined in the same laboratory on the same bench by the same forensic scientist.
Also, there was a 1 centimetre long slit in the bag containing the hairbrush reference samples. There's never been an explanation as to how that happened, the only possibility raised being that it was cut when the envelope they were in was being opened. There's never been any evidence of tampering or wrongdoing, i.e. that someone had done something deliberately, but there has certainly been plenty of discussion about whether there was contamination or the inadvertent transfer of hairs from the reference samples to the tiger blanket evidence. Frustratingly, the reference samples were never counted, so there was no way of knowing if the 2 hairs were missing, if there were 2 hairs missing from the reference sample.
And they counted to 400 on the tiger blanket, but anyway. Also, right at the time of the trial, there was a big inquiry underway into the organisation which carried out the testing. In an unrelated case, that lab had identified the DNA profile of a man at 2 crime scenes, one of them in the North Island, and the man was not in the North Island at the time. And he could also prove he wasn't at the other crime scene either. So how did that DNA match happen? Accidental contamination at the lab. So these things happen, and it's the same lab which conducted the testing of Olivia's hairs.
It's all very, very messy. There was, denials that there was contamination, but yeah, it was messy. And whether the jury took any notice of the forensic evidence in the end is anyone's guess. There's no way of knowing which bits from a jury a trial accepts or discards. And, New Zealand, we can't interview jury members. Mm-hmm. But it's undeniable that the forensic evidence had holes in it, just like the plastic bag. Let's take a quick break.
All right, given this was a 3-month trial, there was a bunch of other evidence, of course. The most dramatic was on a day when the court was closed to the public, and only people directly involved in the case, the prosecution, defence, the jury, the court staff, were allowed in, along with accredited media.
Yeah, and one of them was me. So word had gone around that, I remember this, something big was going to be called in evidence this day. I remember walking into the courtroom and there was this large screen in front of the witness box to shield the identity of whoever was about to give evidence. And this had come after weeks of lots of really mundane evidence, the movement of boats, who was where, and then bang, all of a sudden it got very, very real. So there were 2 men who spoke from behind the screen that day, and they certainly weren't talking about boats and what was where. They alleged that Scott Watson had made Jailhouse confessions to them, and they went into gory details. The pair said they were in Addington prison with Watson while he was on remand, and that separately he had told them how he had gone about the crime, even allegedly giving a demonstration to one of them. But there were things about the Jailhouse snitches' evidence that were odd. One of them said Watson had sort of whispered his confession through a peephole in the cell door of the prison.
Why do people do that? Why would people do that? Anyway.
Like a confessional?
Yeah.
A little...
You think you're in church, but you're actually in prison.
Yeah. The other said Watson had nightmares, waking up screaming, as if this was evidence of guilt.
Who doesn't wake up screaming?
In prison.
Oh, just in general.
Well, okay. I think we better talk about that off mic, Adam. The witness said he challenged Watson about the screaming, to which Watson replied, "They have got nothing on me," which might also just mean, he hadn't done it. So, therefore, the cops didn't have anything on him. Anyway, while what the witnesses had to say seemed thin, it really had an impact on the trial, more importantly on the jury. I remember the looks on their faces. It was tactically smart from the Crown, that's for sure. In fact, the tactics of the Crown were really fascinating. The prosecution needed to be on top of its game at the trial because there were signs beforehand that lots of the evidence was going to come under close scrutiny. The trial itself was held in the High Court at Wellington, but back then, in those days, many cases used to have to go through what was called a depositions hearing, basically a kind of a rehearsal in the district court where the prosecution had to sort of lay out its case to convince a judge that it had enough to go to trial. Often, there's no jury or anything, it's just the judge. Often in such cases, the evidence was just handed up to the judge in written documents and everyone agreed, yep, Okay, there's enough to go to trial. For the Watson case, the depositions hearing was in Blenheim in this tiny courtroom, and there were a few witnesses called to give evidence, as well as the handwritten evidence that was handed up. In particular, Guy Wallace, the water taxi driver, was called. Now, remember, Guy Wallace had been shown 2 montages of photos. Montage A, where he didn't recognise anyone, even though it included a picture of Scott Watson. And then he was shown montage A again, possibly with a different Scott Watson image. And then sometime later, montage B, which had that infamous blink photo of Scott Watson. And it was that photo of Watson that Guy Wallace picked out, saying it looked like the mystery man on the water taxi and the bloke who'd served at the bar. But at the depositions hearing, there was this dramatic development around another photo. Guy Wallace was shown a photo taken on the night of the party. And this goes back to the beginning of the night when the boats were all rafted up together and that kind of strapped. There were 3 boats strapped together, including Watson's boat. It was about, and he'd gone on board one of the boats.
It made a bit of a pest of himself.
Yeah. It was about 10 p.m. and it showed a group of people on board the Mina Cornelia. That was the boat that Scott Watson's yacht Blade was tied up with in this 3-boat raft car park on the sea. Watson was one of the people in that group photo from the Mina Cornelia, and he was clean shaven with short hair receding at the temples and wearing a denim shirt. Guy Wallace had previously described the man as having shaggy hair and having good growth on his chin and face. At the depositions hearing, Guy Wallace was thrown by the Mina Cornelia photo when it was shown to him by the defence, saying he found it hard to believe the photo was taken on New Year's Eve. This is part of the exchange with the lawyer. I'll be the defence lawyer.
I'll be Guy Wallace.
Okay. So, defence lawyer. Just accept for me, for the moment, if you would, that photograph was taken some hours before you dropped those people off to the ketch.
Guy Wallace. Okay.
Defence. That is proved by other evidence in the case, and I believe it was sometime around 10 or 10:30 p.m. on New Year's Eve.
Well, says Guy Wallace, if that is the case, then it wasn't Scott Watson that I dropped off.
Boom. I have covered many court cases, and I can say that was one of the very few times I've literally heard gasps in the courtroom. Like, it was just sensational. And you know that when you watch courtroom dramas, that sort of thing happens all the time.
Yeah.
It doesn't. Mostly it's very slow and procedural. But this was one of those moments. There were other moments in the depositions hearing when the Crown case seemed shaky. So before the trial came around, there were some changes. For instance, there was a new lawyer brought in to lead the prosecution team, Paul Davison, who at that time was a prominent QC, Queen's Counsel. He was extremely sharp.
So it's almost like they've had a bit of a dress rehearsal and they can iron out the kinks, right?
Yeah. And that goes both ways.
Yeah.
Goes both ways.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, notwithstanding that revelation or that moment, Watson's trial went ahead. Because there was all this other evidence. So when Guy Wallace came to the stand, the prosecution was well and truly prepared, as you alluded to. Paul Davison led the questioning of Guy Wallace when he gave his evidence, and he carefully stepped through everything, meticulously squaring away the inconsistencies around his identification of Scott Watson, doing all he could to make sure the jury came away with the impression Guy Wallace believed the mystery man was the man in photograph 3 from montage B, i.e. Scott Watson. Under questioning, Guy Wallace agreed that he'd picked out Watson from the montage of photos, that montage B, asked if the photo he'd picked out from that montage matched the man who served at the bar, the man he'd seen in the garden bar another time, the man who got into the water taxi, and the person who he dropped off with Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. Guy Wallace's answer was that it was, quote, the same person. So, tick. Then Paul Davison quizzed him about that photo from the Mina Cornelia, the one that had caused a dramatic moment in the depositions hearing. And Guy Wallace only went as far as saying it was, quote, quite difficult to say from that photo if it was the mystery man. So it was not a tick, but certainly not the damning evidence he'd given in the depositions hearing. He was even asked about that video footage of Scott Watson that the TV reporter had shown him back at the start of the investigation. Remember, he'd told the reporter that wasn't the mystery man. In court, though, Guy Wallace said the footage was too, quote, unclear for a definite yes or no answer. So Guy Wallace had even walked that back a little bit under questioning from Paul Davison. So by the time Paul Davison had finished questioning Guy Wallace, any doubts there might have been about his identification of Scott Watson were sort of fading away. The mystery man Guy Wallace saw was Scott Watson. But then it was the defence's turn to question Guy Wallace. Could they do anything to cast doubt, bring back these doubts? Guy Wallace was asked about all the description he'd given the police, drawing attention to his descriptions of the mystery man as, quote, unkempt.
It's just, there's a lot of stubble in this case, right?
Yeah.
It's all about clean-shaven stubble, long
right.
hair, short hair, long hair, short hair.
Very much
We
so.
don't think about facial hair as much as we should, perhaps. Anyway, sorry.
Well, some of us.
I'll let you get on with this.
Yeah, says the Peter one. With stubble on his face. Of course, the photo taken of Scott Watson on the Mina Cornelia showed him with short hair, clean-shaven, a point which the defence made, whereas, Guy Wallace has said the guy was unkempt. It all came down to the photo montage in that infamous photo 3, the blink photo. It was put to Guy Wallace that, quote, really, it was the eyes of number 3 that struck you more than anything else, wasn't it? Guy Wallace said, yes. And he agreed that that was because the eyes were half closed. Now, given that it was a strange photo of Scott Watson, that was worth pointing out. After the defence had grilled Wallace, it was the prosecution's chance to question him one last time. This is how things work in trials. So whoever has called the witness in the first place gets to question them last. So if it's the prosecution who calls a witness, then they ask questions of them, the defence gets a chance to ask questions of them, then it comes back to the prosecution.
Yep.
So this is what happened here. So Paul Davison honed in on photo 3 from montage B. Guy Wallace told Paul Davison that he had picked out that photo because, quote, overall, he was just more similar to the man that I had seen in the bar that night. He was then asked how sure he was, and he said, quote, well, very sure, like the eyes had a very mistrusting look. Once all the questioning of Guy Wallace was over, when it came to the identification issue, the prosecution had done a solid job, leaving the jury with the impression that Guy Wallace had identified Scott Watson as the mystery man.
But not long after the trial, Guy Wallace and Roz, the bar manager on the night, both signed affidavits, which are pretty legally serious documents, right? Saying they did not believe Scott Watson was the mystery man. They were both adamant the police had the wrong man. Guy Wallace even said if he had been asked if the man in the dock, Scott Watson, in the court, was a mystery man, he would have said no. But in multiple appeals and reviews of the case, the conclusion always was these questions of identity were focused on intensely during the trial and thus were up to the jury to decide. So it's like, no mistake, the jury heard everything they needed and they still made that call. Of course, the identification question wasn't the end of it for the prosecution because there are a couple of other hurdles Paul Davison and the team had to figure out how to deal with. Not least of which was the fact that Guy Wallace remained adamant he'd dropped the couple off at a ketch, 2 masts, when Scott Watson's yacht was a sloop, 1 mast. A pretty big inconvenience, to say the least. So the prosecution was saying, listen to this bloke, Guy Wallace, members of the jury, he's bang on about the identity of the mystery man. Well, he got there in the end anyway. But they're also saying, but don't listen to him about the ketch stuff. There was no ketch. So instead, around the boat stuff, the prosecution relied on the, what Eugene kind of called the marine inquiry into the movement of boats in the Marlborough Sounds aspect to persuade the jury on that element. Like, there was no ketch. We've counted all the boats in, we've counted all the boats out, and Scott Watson's yacht is the one Olivia and Ben got onto. Another troublesome aspect for the prosecution was a bit of a curveball. So another water taxi driver who'd been on duty at Furneaux that night also gave evidence about taking a man out to a boat about 2:30 a.m. This other water taxi driver spent 5 hours on the stand under heavy questioning because his evidence was intriguing. He spoke about a scruffy man in a denim shirt, that lines up with at least some of the descriptions of Scott Watson that night, And also he had that denim shirt on in the Mina Cornelia photo. So this water taxi driver says he took this man to a sloop, one mast, which was about 8.6 metres long. I don't know if I could estimate fractions of metres, but anyway, about 8.6 metres long. And, get this, it had a name which reminded him of something sharp. And Scott Watson's yacht was called Blade. And blades are sharp, unless they're blunt, but still they're sharp in general. In March 1998, this witness had this to say about Blade. I've seen that many pictures of it now. I'm confident it was Scott Watson's boat I dropped this person off at. So this was awkward. The second water taxi driver was incredibly convincing, and it kind of all adds up. The dude looks like Scott Watson being dropped off to Scott Watson's boat. All of those things. Yeah, it makes sense, hey? And if you accepted what he was saying, it was clear Scott Watson had returned to his boat at 2:30 a.m. on his own. And there was other evidence from people on the Mina Cornelia and Bianco about how they'd heard Watson making a bit of a ruckus around this time and that he was alone. So remember, the Guy Wallace trip was closer to 4 a.m. and involved 3 people getting on board the boat. And the defence banged home its point. That was Scott Watson on this 2:30 a.m. trip with the other water taxi. Therefore, he could not possibly be the mystery man on that later trip. So that's pretty solid, but not so fast. Like I said, the second water taxi driver's testimony was a curveball for the prosecution, and it took a curveball in return. Actually, I'm not sure if that's a thing.
Yeah.
Curveballs to curveballs. Don't you do something with a bat in the middle? But anyway, whatever. It got screwy in both directions is what we're trying to emphasise here. So during the closing address, the prosecution conceded that Scott Watson was indeed the man on that earlier water taxi trip out to the boat with a name reminiscent of something sharp, maybe Blade. They'd never put any obvious evidence before the jury about this. No witness to say, yep, that was Watson on the 2:30 trip. But in the closing address, the prosecution was almost nonchalant about it because it reasoned it could be inferred Watson had somehow then returned to Furneaux Lodge, which would have him back on shore to be able to be on the Guy Wallace trip and all the rest of the case.
Yeah, this became known as the two-trip theory. It wasn't as dramatic as the depositions hearing moment, but it was still a what the actual fuck moment when it emerged during the closing address. Essentially, the prosecution had played a blinder, keeping quiet on the issue altogether, seeking neither to prove or disprove whether Watson was on that earlier water taxi trip, and then in the closing address, bang, revealing its hand and saying, yeah, look, he was on that, and he must have got back to shore somehow, without having offered any evidence of how he did this. It was a glaring gap in the prosecution narrative of the night, but they were like, so what? This was one of the factors Watson's defence based its first appeal on, saying it was unfair to the Crown to basically blindside everyone with the two-trip theory. But the Court of Appeal kind of shrugged its shoulders and said, should have seen it coming. The judges said, look, the timing and circumstances of the first water taxi trip was always going to be important, and you should have nailed it down better. The two-trip theory, the judges said, must have been a possible Crown contention right from the very outset. They said there was nothing unfair in the way the Crown presented its case to the jury. Appeal dismissed. That unsuccessful appeal was back in 2000. Scott Watson is still in jail, still maintaining his innocence, still trying to prove he didn't do it. Then in 2025, he had another chance to make his case before the Court of Appeal for it to decide if there had been a miscarriage of justice. Watson's arguments centred on the forensic evidence about the hairs and the challenges to the way the identification evidence was gathered and used. When you boil everything down, it's those two things, the ID evidence and the hairs, which are smack bang in the middle of this case. Take them away and you're left with a lot of noise and circumstantial evidence, but nothing that directly links Scott Watson to the disappearance of Ben and Olivia. On the hair evidence, the judges in the 2025 case to the appeal court dismissed Watson's argument. They ruled that the risk of contamination was, quote, extremely unlikely given the method used, and they also found that the cut in the bag was made after the blonde hairs had been collected from the Tiger blanket. So in other words, the cut doesn't suggest the hairs somehow accidentally escaped. On the identification evidence, as we said at the beginning, there was a lot of discussion about Montage B and the way Guy Wallace's evidence came about. In the end, the court concluded that Watson's appearance, the so-called blink shot or the hooded eyes shot, did not predispose Wallace to pick him out. Other men in the montage looked sufficiently similar, the judges said. Furthermore, the court said it had considered all the evidence from people who talked about the lone man in the bar and those who interacted with the lone man in the water taxi. In other words, it was trying to figure out if there were two similar-looking lone men in the bar that night. After all, and then after all that, the court said this.
The evidence supported a conclusion that the witnesses were discussing their interactions with the same man, Mr. Watson.
And that was not all. It set aside the possibility of a catch, and it supported the so-called two-trip theory. So in the end, a resounding case dismissed. No miscarriage of justice.
But that's not likely to persuade Watson's supporters, is it? I mean,
No.
His father said after the decision that the family would keep fighting. His lawyer, Kerry Cook, said he had been instructed to lodge an appeal to the Supreme Court.
And there are plenty of other ways in which people have sought to cast doubt on Watson's convictions. Over the years, I've covered other aspects of the case, things which really do raise serious questions. A few years ago, I was part of an investigative team which exposed flaws in the evidence about where the mystery man's yacht must have been, evidence which pointed away from Scott Watson's yacht Blade. It was compelling, but it just went nowhere. There was another story a few months after the trial which did cause quite a kerfuffle. Myself and Alison Horwood, a newspaper colleague who I worked with on the case, we got a call one day out of the blue but from one of those two secret Jailhouse witnesses, the one who talked about the nightmares. And we went to see him, and we actually spent a couple of days with him, and he told us that he wanted to recant his evidence and that it was a load of bullshit. When he met with Alison and me, he was absolutely convincing. He was also a very, very troubled guy. He attempted suicide not long after talking to us. Not the first time he'd experienced serious mental health issues. These were serious allegations which raised serious questions about Jailhouse witnesses, and in particular why the Crown had relied on this man. These mental health issues went back way before the trial. In the end, though, it all went nowhere. After our story came out, he was approached by the police and he recanted his recanting. What are we left with from that back and forth? I'm not sure. Look, I said earlier, the secret witnesses had a dramatic effect, if you like. Ultimately, though, I'm unclear whether their evidence was something relied on by the jury anyway. The defence did a good job pointing out the flaws, but it certainly seems to me that the justice system should be extremely careful about allowing testimony from so-called jailhouse snitches. But that is a whole other episode, I imagine.
Or a bunch of episodes, because New Zealand's got a slightly murky history with
It
jailhouse
comes up from
snitches,
time to
right?
time.
Anyway, so now it comes down to whether Scott Watson can get his case heard by the Supreme Court. And if he won the appeal, what would that mean? Would there be a retrial? For starters, the star witness in this whole case is now dead. In March 2021, Guy Wallace was found dead at his home on the west coast of the South Island. He left a 2-page suicide note, which included mention of his views on the Scott Watson case, but exactly what he said in that note was suppressed by the coroner. Given he'd maintained for 2 decades that he believed Scott Watson was not the mystery man, despite his evidence at the trial, we can probably take a guess as to some of what was in that note. To be clear, Guy Wallace had a lot of stressors in his life at that time. He was about to stand trial himself for indecently assaulting a teenage girl, charges which he denied. His marriage had broken up. He was in a property dispute with his ex-wife. He'd also been through treatment for stage 3 cancer, so he had a lot going on. And Guy Wallace must have gone through many what-if scenarios about the case as well. He wished he'd never been dragged into it. In 2007, he told our journalist colleague Mike White in a piece for North and South magazine that he felt he'd been shafted by the police. Mike has also interviewed Scott Watson's father, Chris, and Chris said his son was someone who tried very hard to help those investigating Ben and Olivia's disappearance, sometimes too hard.
When I was reporting on the murder case, Guy Wallace struck me as a bit of a pitiful figure. I'd always ended up feeling sorry for him, insofar as the Watson case is concerned anyway. While his evidence about the mystery man was put through the ringer at the trial, there was never any doubt about the identity of the couple he dropped off, Ben Smart and Olivia Hope, and that left Guy Wallace with a deep regret. He told Mike White in 2007, "What I feel shithouse about is that I dropped them off and I had the opportunity not to drop them off." Because that's the thing. Strip everything else away, all the controversy, all the legal steps to deal with an alleged miscarriage of justice, and you got 2 kids who went missing that night, never to be seen again. 2 families robbed of those young, bright lives.
Scott Watson remains in prison. In January 2026, he was denied parole for the 5th time and was told that he should undertake further treatment to address his attitudes to violence and women and to have an assessment for autism spectrum disorder, which that last bit came somewhat out of the blue. The parole board heard evidence about Watson's behaviour in prison and was shown footage of an incident where he got one inmate in a headlock and there's some pushing and shoving. Watson described it as a play fight, but expressed remorse, acknowledging that he sometimes said stupid things and made jokes in poor taste. "I think there is something in me," he said, "that self-sabotages." On the killing of Olivia Hope and Ben Smart, though, Watson was adamant he was innocent.
In 2007, Watson married a woman in a private prison ceremony, but that relationship ended after 3 years. In 2012, his mother Beverly died. Watson was allowed to attend the funeral under guard. I remember Beverly and her husband Chris from the court case. They attended every single day, and neither of them ever wavered in their belief that their son was innocent.
So what do you reckon? You sat through all those days in court, you did all those follow-up stories. Did Scott Watson do it?
Honestly, I have no idea. Were there aspects of the trial and the evidence I found troubling? In my opinion, yes. Did Watson do himself any favours? Hell no. But did he do it? I'm going to pull a classic move of mine and avoid giving my opinion by putting forward someone else's.
Okay.
And it comes from the most recent parole board hearing. According to RNZ's report, there was something someone said, something which I'd never heard before. Someone coming up with an explanation of what they think actually happened on the boat that night. Board member Dr. Jeremy Skipworth laid it out to Watson like this. It was what he said was the most likely scenario. When the 2 victims indicated that they needed a place to sleep, you may have offered them a berth with a genuine intention of hospitality. It's known that you were intoxicated that night and likely both victims. Once on board, a confrontation may have arisen through a social misunderstanding or some form of inappropriate behaviour from you. As you had learnt to rely on violence, including reaching for weapons during confrontations, with 3 individuals essentially trapped with potentially limited ability to de-escalate the situation, an unintended tragedy may have taken place, leading to the first victim's death. You have a distinct pattern of not taking responsibility for your actions and shifting blame and distress alongside an overconfidence in your ability to cover up or get away with things. Therefore, it could be considered that your natural tendency would be to cover up such an event to avoid responsibility.
That's quite a scenario. And the frustrating thing is we'll probably never find out if it's right. Frustrating in particular for the Hope and Smart families. Back in 2007, Olivia's father, Gerald, told the Herald on Sunday that he had doubts over Watson's double murder conviction. It's a careful statement because he certainly doesn't proclaim Watson's innocence, but it's interesting. So what we got was a conviction, but we never got the truth, Hope said. Nothing ever was confirmed. It was all circumstantial. There was no hard evidence. And that's where my greatest doubts lie. I'm not saying Scott Watson is not guilty. What I'm saying is, let's clear up the doubt.
Long Story Short is a Te Pūrongo production. I'm Eugene Bingham, he's Adam Dudding, and over in the corner is Connor Scott, who is producing, editing and wrangling us.
We would like to thank my old mate Anton Morgan for writing the theme music, and Phil Johnson, who designed the awesome Long Story Short artwork and logo. Thank you also to the many journalists who have covered this case over the years, particularly Mike White.
We're on all the usual podcast platforms and also on YouTube and everywhere else. So please subscribe, give us 5 stars, or even maybe write a nice little review. And we will see you soon with the next episode of Long Story Short.
Ka kite.